Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, January 27, 2022. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer announces he will retire at the end of the current court term in June or July, or a little later if a replacement is not yet confirmed by the Senate. Breyer saying that it's up to young people to ensure the American experiment of democracy works, and that he's an optimist and thinks it will. Breyer speaking at the White House alongside President Joe Biden, who commended Breyer's 28 years on the high court, calling him a model public servant at a time of great division in this country. President Biden also saying he intends to nominate a successor by the end of February, and in keeping with his campaign pledge, it will be a black woman. First time ever. President calling it long overdue. Also today, U.S. House Democrats introducing a resolution to declare that the Equal Rights Amendment is already part of the Constitution. Today is the 2-year anniversary of Virginia becoming the 38th state to ratify the amendment, and today's the day the amendment would take effect, but there is dispute over whether the ratification process took too long. We'll get the latest from a reporter with The Hill. Education Secretary Cardona calling for funding increases to federal grants for schools for low-income students and students with disabilities. Plus, we'll get updates from the State Department and Pentagon on Russia and Ukraine, all ahead on Washington Today. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer sending a letter to President Biden announcing his retirement. It takes effect, he says, when the current term ends, assuming a successor has been nominated and confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Breyer writing in part, "I enormously appreciate the privilege of serving as part of the federal judicial system. I have found the work challenging and meaningful. I have also been aware of the great honor of participating as a judge in an effort to maintain our Constitution and the rule of law." Breyer then went to the White House to meet with the president, and the two spoke publicly. First, here's President Biden thanking and praising Justice Breyer.
Today, Justice Breyer announces his intention to step down from active service after 4 decades on the federal bench and 28 years on the United States Supreme Court. His legacy includes his work as a leading scholar and jurist in administrative law, bringing his brilliance to bear to make government run more efficiently and effectively. It includes his stature as a beacon of wisdom on our Constitution and what it means. And through it all, Justice Breyer has worked tirelessly to give faith to the notion that the law exists to help the people. Everyone knows that Stephen Breyer has been an exemplary justice, fair to the parties before him, courteous to his colleagues, careful in his reasoning. He's written landmark opinions on topics ranging from reproductive rights to health care, to voting rights, to patent law, to laws protecting our environment and the laws that protect our religious practices. His opinions are practical, sensible, and nuanced. It reflects his belief that a job of a judge is not to lay down a rule, but to get it right, Justice Breyer's law clerks and his colleagues, as many of the press here know, describe him and his work ethic, his desire to learn more, his kindness to those around him, and his optimism for the promise of our country. And he has patiently sought common ground and built consensus, seeking to bring the court together. I think he's a model public servant in a time of great division in this country.
President Biden at the White House in the Roosevelt Room with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. Breyer was confirmed to the court in 1994, nominated by President Bill Clinton, and it was then Senator Joe Biden who chaired the Judiciary Committee that considered the nomination. Justice Breyer also speaking today for a few minutes, talking about the wonder and fragility of the U.S. democratic system.
Something I enjoy is talking to high school students, grammar school students, college students, even law school students, and they'll come around and ask me, what is it you find particularly meaningful about your job? What sort of gives you a thrill? And that's not such a tough question for me to answer. It's the same thing. Day one, almost, up to day I don't know how many. But what I say to them is, look, I sit there on the bench, and after we hear lots of cases, and after a while, the impression, it takes a while, I have to admit, but the impression you get is, as you well know, this is a complicated country. There are more than 330 million people, and my mother used to say it's every race, it's every religion, and she would emphasize this, and it's every point of view possible. And It's a kind of miracle when you sit there and see all those people in front of you, people that are so different in what they think, and yet they've decided to help solve their major differences under law. And when the students get too cynical, I say, go look at what happens in countries that don't do that. And that's there. I can't take this around in my job. People have come to accept this Constitution, and they've come to accept the importance of a rule of law. And I want to make another point to them. I want to say, look, of course people don't agree, but we have a country that is based on human rights, democracy, and so forth. But I'll tell you what Lincoln thought, what Washington thought, and what people today still think. It's an experiment. It's an experiment. That's what they said. And Joanna paid each of our grandchildren a certain amount of money to memorize the Gettysburg Address. And the reason that what we want them to pick up there, and what I want those students to pick up, if I can remember the first two lines, is that 7 years ago, our fathers created upon this here a new country, a country that was dedicated to liberty and the proposition that all men are created equal. Conceived in liberty, those are his words, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He meant women too. And we are now engaged in a great civil war to determine whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. See, those are the words I want to see. An experiment. And that's what he thought. It's an experiment. And I found some letters that George Washington wrote where he said the same thing. It's an experiment. That experiment existed then because even the liberals in Europe, they're looking over here and they're saying it's a great idea in principle, but it'll never work. But we'll show them it does. That's what Washington thought. And that's what Lincoln thought. And that's what people still think today. And I say, well, I want you, and I'm talking to the students now. I say, I want you to pick just this up. It's an experiment that's still going on. And I'll tell you something. You know who will see whether that experiment works? It's you, my friend. It's you, Mr. High School student. It's you, Mr. College student. It's you, Mr. Law School students. It's us, but it's you. It's that next generation and the one after that. My grandchildren and their children. They'll determine whether the experiment still works. And of course, I am an optimist, and I'm pretty sure it will. Does it surprise you that that's the thought that comes into my mind today? I don't know, but thank you.
Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer at the White House with President Biden. In the history of the United States, there have been 115 people who have served on the U.S. Supreme Court. And in terms of tenure, Breyer's 27.5 years currently is 23rd. The current Justice Clarence Thomas is in 15th place with just over 30 years. The record, William O. Douglas, at 36.5 years. President Biden today also outlining how and when he plans to go about choosing his first Supreme Court nominee to replace Justice Breyer.
Choosing someone to sit in the Supreme Court, I believe, is one of the most serious constitutional responsibility a president has. Our process is going to be rigorous. I will select a nominee worthy of Justice Breyer's legacy of excellence and decency. While I've been studying candidates' backgrounds and writings, I've made no decision except one. The person I will nominate will be someone with extraordinary qualifications, character, experience, and integrity. And that person will be the first Black woman ever nominated to the United States Supreme Court. It's long overdue in my view. I made that commitment during the campaign for president, and I will keep that commitment. I will fully do what I said I'd do. I will fulfill my duty to select a justice, not only with the Senate's consent, but with his advice. You've heard me say in other nomination processes that the Constitution says seek the advice and consent, but the advice as well of the Senate. I'm going to invite senators from both parties to offer their ideas and points of view. I'll also consult with leading scholars and lawyers. And I'm fortunate to have advising me in this selection process Vice President Kamala Harris. She's an exceptional lawyer, former Attorney General of the state of California, a former member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I will listen carefully to all the advice I'm given, and I'll study the records and former cases carefully. I'll meet with the potential nominees, and it is my intention to announce my decision before the end of February. I have made no choice at this point. Once I select a nominee, I will ask the Senate to move promptly on my choice. In the end, I will nominate a historic candidate, someone who's worthy of Justice Breyer's legacy, and someone who, like Justice Breyer, will provide incredible service on the United States Supreme Court.
President Joe Biden at the White House. A story at Bloomberg Law says that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, wants to confirm President Biden's choice to replace Justice Stephen Breyer on an expedited timeline that would take only weeks to finish. Schumer plans to move Biden's nominee through the process on a timeline similar to that used by Republicans to confirm Justice Amy Coney Barrett in 2020. According to a person familiar with his plans, she was confirmed 30 days after then-President Donald Trump made the nomination. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki asked at her briefing who might be helping in the search for a nominee.
Who here at the White House is helping the president to sort of lead this search effort? Is this Ron Klain who's helping him go through this process? And would he then be the person to kind of shepherd the nominee through the Hill process as well, through meetings and such?
Sure. Well, first, the vice president will play a central role in this process, and the president intends to consult with her very closely. Obviously, she has a long history as a former attorney general, as a member of the Judiciary Committee, and he respects her opinion greatly. In addition to the Vice President, Ron Klain will, of course, play a role. Dana Remus, Cedric Richmond, Paige Herwig, who's a member of our counsel's office, and Louisa Terrell. As has been standard in the past, we would anticipate bringing in additional expertise from the outside to advise during the confirmation process. Would expect we would have that team in place prior to a selection, but that is not finalized at this point.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki with reporters in the White House briefing room. The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell from Kentucky put out a statement that first praised retiring Justice Stephen Breyer, saying that he commands respect and affection across the legal world, including from those who disagree with his judicial philosophy and conclusion in cases. But later in that statement, Senator McConnell writes, looking ahead, the American people elected a Senate that is evenly split at 50-50. To the degree that President Biden received a mandate, it was to govern from the middle, steward our institutions, and unite America. The president must not outsource this important decision to the radical left. The American people deserve a nominee who demonstrated reverence for the written text of our laws and our Constitution. That statement from Senator McConnell. Republican Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri is a member of the Judiciary Committee, which will be holding the hearings and then voting on the nominee before the full Senate. Senator Hawley was on Fox News Channel Wednesday night when it was apparent that there was going to be a retirement announcement from Justice Breyer.
Joe Biden has said he will only choose an African-American woman. Do you believe that to be constitutional?
Well, I believe it to be typical of this administration, which has been the most race-obsessed, gender-obsessed in terms of trying to deconstruct genders, actually. I mean, this is a hard, woke left administration. And so I wasn't surprised at all when the president said that this is what he's going to do. Here's what I think, Sean. It's a real moment of truth for Joe Biden. He's deeply unpopular. He's been the most divisive president of my lifetime. Now he's got a choice. Is he going to nominate a pro-America, pro-Constitution justice, or is he going to keep doing what he's been doing and divide this country with a hard, woke left activist? We're about to find out. I hope Republicans are ready to stand up for the Constitution.
Senator Josh Hawley on Fox News Channel Wednesday night. He's a Republican and a member of the Judiciary Committee. New York Times' Michael Shear writing that President Biden's pledge to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court, which appears to be on the verge of being fulfilled, has generated howls of criticism from some conservatives. But it may be that the president's critics have a short memory. In 1980, Ronald Reagan used a similar demographic promise as he fought for support among female voters in his battle for the White House against Jimmy Carter. And President Reagan did end up nominating a woman, the first woman, to the Supreme Court. Some of the possible nominees that have been talked about for President Biden include Ketanji Brown Jackson, Federal Appeals Court Judge, D.C. Circuit, Leandra Kruger, California Supreme Court Justice, and Michelle Childs, U.S. District Judge, District of South Carolina. Today, Congressman James Clyburn, Democrat from South Carolina, was asked if he planned to lobby for his home state favorite.
You know, Biden has definitely heard, as you know, your call for a Black woman to be on the Supreme Court. But one of the things that he actually said shortly after Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died was that if he were to be elected president and he had to go through a nominations process, he would want the input of Democrat and Republican senators who are going to obviously oversee this confirmation process, because he doesn't want it to become a partisan event like we've seen it in the last couple years. Do you think that Childs does have potentially appeal among Republican senators? And are you thinking of doing what you do best, picking up the phone, whipping some votes, talking to Senate Republicans to see if your pick is going to actually get some support?
Absolutely. We have two Republican senators from South Carolina. Both of them know Michelle Childs very well, and both of them have spoken highly of her. And the Republicans all over the state think that she's an outstanding judge. Remember, I may have left this out. She was a state circuit judge before she became a federal district judge. So if you look at the experience, there's nobody sitting on the Supreme Court today that can tout the background, the experience, life and profession that Michelle Childs will bring to the court. It's just that simple. And I think that Republicans appreciate that as much as Democrats. And I've heard from Republicans since yesterday. They are very high on her. And not just here in South Carolina. I've heard from as far away as Illinois in the last 24 hours when people says they like her, they have watched her. She's president of the Federal Judges Association. I don't think they would have elevated her to that point were she not really qualified for that.
The House Majority Whip, James Clyburn, interviewed today by Washington Post congressional reporter Mariana Sotomayor. This is Washington Today. On the timing of Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer's retirement, we spoke with Lawrence Hurley, Supreme Court reporter for Thomson Reuters.
Liberal activists have been very anxious about Justice Breyer because of his age at 83 now, and also because of what happened with Justice Ginsburg, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who Democrats at one point had kind of wanted to retire when President Obama was president. She didn't. And then ultimately she died during the Trump administration, and that allowed President Donald Trump to replace her. So, and that helped to make the court a 6-3 conservative majority. So the Democrats are keen for at least Breyer's seat to go to another Democratic appointee.
Reporter Lawrence Hurley. There is also the consideration the Democrats hold the slimmest possible Senate majority currently, half the seats, 50, with Vice President Kamala Harris, President of the Senate, breaking the tie in favor of the Democrats. And the Senate Democrats, therefore, can confirm a Supreme Court nominee if all 50 hold together and vote yes, assuming all 50 Republicans vote no. That's put some spotlight on the two Democratic senators who have been holding up other pieces of legislation from the Biden administration, like voting rights reform and the Build Back Better social spending and climate package, that could pass if all 50 agreed, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Senator Sinema putting out a statement that reads, "As with all nominees, as I did during the 2020 Supreme Court nomination, I look forward to fulfilling my constitutional duty to provide advice and consent by thoughtfully examining the next nominee based on 3 criteria: whether the nominee is professionally qualified, believes in the role of an independent judiciary, and can be trusted to faithfully interpret and uphold the rule of law." And for Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, he did an interview with Metro News saying that it would be okay if the nominee was more liberal than he is. He says it's not too hard to get more liberal than me, so it would not bother me having a person who is sound in their thought process and has been sound in their disbursement of justice and the rule of law. More from reporter Lawrence Hurley. We asked him how Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer will be remembered. What's his legacy?
Well, one thing is that throughout his tenure on the court, he was basically in the minority because it's been a conservative court throughout that time. The liberal justices obviously did have some high-profile victories during that time when they managed to bring over Justice Anthony Kennedy when he was on the court to provide some big majorities on cases like gay marriage. And so he probably will be most remembered for his vote in those kind of big cases. But then individually, he's known as someone who wanted to build consensus. I think he's pretty respected by his colleagues. More recently, he came out against the death penalty, which is a view that not many of the other justices share. And he's a kind of law professor type character. He has interests outside of the court and things like architecture. So he's a kind of a Renaissance man in some ways with his different interests. And he'll be remembered as a respected member of the liberal minority who was able to cobble together majorities in some big cases.
Lawrence Hurley, Supreme Court reporter with Thomson Reuters. As the confirmation process for the replacement for Justice Breyer plays out, you can follow it all on the C-SPAN networks. From thehill.com, there's this. House Democrats unveiled a resolution on Thursday that would formally recognize as part of the Constitution the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, banning discrimination on the basis of sex. The resolution states it is the sense of the House that the ERA has met the requirements of the Constitution and become valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution. Today is the 2-year anniversary of Virginia's becoming the 38th state to ratify the ERA, and the date that the amendment would become part of the Constitution if, in fact, all conditions are met. But that is not agreed upon by everyone. We'll talk about that with the reporter from that story. First, at a rally today in front of the White House in support of the ERA and the view that it's already been ratified, here is Eleanor Smeal, president and co-founder of the Feminist Majority Foundation.
We have won. The ERA has met all the requirements for the ratification of an amendment, and we intend to get it certified and published. Why do women have to work twice as hard for half as much? Even now, they're throwing more wrenches in it. But no matter how many wrenches, we're not going to lose another generation of women and people and LGBT people and people who are not binary. We're not going to lose any. We want a country where everybody's full potential is not only realized, but they can't be discriminated against. They are denied that. This is a matter of I can't even explain how hard it is, but how worthwhile it is. What would be a world of full equality? And the message that came out of our press conference today is we're going to make sure this amendment is enforced. And we're going to start, we believe it is in effect, and incidentally, the House of Representatives has a resolution saying that the Equal Rights Amendment is ratified and that it should be certified and published. So we're going to have the House soon. We are going to make sure that we spread this word, and I know that we're going to try to get states to look at their constitutions, but not only that, their laws.
Eleanor Smeal is president and co-founder of the Feminist Majority Foundation, speaking at a rally in Lafayette Park across the street from the White House. More on the status of the Equal Rights Amendment now. We're joined by Cristina Marcos, congressional reporter for The Hill. Thank you for joining us. You write about this resolution that Eleanor Smeal referenced, introduced by House Democrats, to declare the ERA is part of the Constitution. Why would the resolution be needed? What is the controversy?
Well, Democrats and the Biden administration want to clear this issue up for good because whether or not it can be ratified has been in dispute. So Congress cleared its approval of the ERA all the way back in 1972, and the states had up to roughly a decade after that, to reach the 3/4 of states necessary to amend the Constitution. But that didn't happen until 2020, when Virginia became the 38th state to approve the Equal Rights Amendment. And so the Trump administration at the time issued an advisory opinion saying that that Virginia's vote didn't count because it was after the statutory deadline to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment decades ago. However, Democrats are arguing that Virginia and other states that had ratified it in recent years should count, and that the Equal Rights Amendment should be considered as an amendment to the Constitution. So the Biden administration is urging Congress to pass a resolution that states, for the record, that the ERA should be considered as part of the Constitution.
In terms of process, there's also, I read that there are calls for the Biden Justice Department to rescind the Trump Justice Department memo. Will that do it, or does the resolution in Congress bear some greater weight?
The Democrats are actually urging the Biden administration to rescind that 2020 advisory opinion altogether, because this latest advisory opinion that the Justice Department issued on Wednesday, simply it says that its previous opinion doesn't preclude Congress from acting on this. And so the Biden administration is saying, well, now Congress shouldn't be held back from acting. But in Congress, Democrats are saying the Biden administration needs to do more. So there's kind of still a tug of war here, with both the two branches arguing that the other should be doing more here in the meantime.
If the U.S. House were to pass this, it would still have to pass the Senate. Is it subject to a filibuster?
That's right. So Democrats are quite unified on this issue. Even the two Democratic centrists in the Senate who've held up much of President Biden's agenda over the last year, that's Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, in the past, they have co-sponsored resolutions to remove the ratification deadline for the Equal Rights Amendment. So there are signs here that there was unified Democrat support here. However, because this would be subject to a 60-vote threshold in the Senate, they would need to get 10 Senate Republicans to back this. And there's no indication that they could do that. So this issue, like much of the president's agenda, would likely yet again be stymied by the Senate filibuster.
Cristina Marcos is with The Hill. Final question for those who hear this issue come up every couple of years, literally. What would the Equal Rights Amendment do? What type of changes could it make to society?
Officially, the Equal Rights Amendment would bar discrimination on the basis of sex. And so Democrats proponents of the Equal Rights Amendment argue that it's important to get that statutorily into the Constitution to ensure equal rights on the basis of sex. But Republicans have long been opposed to this, and one of the main arguments that they put forward against it is that they're concerned that it could result in fewer abortion restrictions, because they're concerned that a lack of abortion access would be considered as sex discrimination, and so that's something that they're concerned could have a real life impact. But Democrats have argued that a lot of the arguments that opponents of the amendment put forward back in the 1970s and 1980s haven't come to fruition. They're arguing that this would simply bring the U.S. In the same place as many of its international counterparts.
Cristina Marcos, congressional reporter for The Hill. Find her story at thehill.com. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Washington Today continues in a minute.
This week on the Lectures in History podcast, a discussion on how the Civil War tested the limits of the U.S. Constitution. Penn State professor Rachel Sheldon explains.
So this week, we are talking about what happens when compromise fails, when the Constitution does not provide answers to what to do about this slavery question.
The Lectures in History podcast. Find it and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. UPI, United Press International, has a story. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona said Thursday that the department aims to concentrate on helping students who fell behind during distance learning last year and ensure teachers are paid enough so that they want to stay in their profession. Cardona made the comments at the Department of Education while laying out his top priorities for the year as the nation's schools continue to adapt to changes forced by the coronavirus pandemic, including lockdowns and virtual learning. Here's part of the speech.
To improve and elevate our education system, we must unapologetically address opportunity and achievement gaps that are pervasive in our country. This means acknowledging that many of the students who have been underserved during the pandemic are the same students who have had to deal with barriers to high-quality education since well before COVID-19. We can't lose this moment, this chance for a reset in education, by going back to the same pre-pandemic strategies that didn't address inequities for Latinos, for Black, for Native students, for students from low-income backgrounds or students from rural communities, for students with disabilities or students experiencing homelessness, or for English learners. Instead, let's do what America does best. Let's turn crisis into opportunity. It means increasing funding for Title I schools, those serving communities most in need, and in many cases, those who are hardest hit by the pandemic. It means increasing funding for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, so that every eligible child with a disability can access a free, appropriate public education. It means not allowing for a culture of low standards or low expectations for some students and some families over others. It means providing every family and every child the opportunity to start out on an equal playing field by providing free, universal preschool and affordable, high-quality, inclusive childcare. It means utilizing rescue plan funds to ensure in the coming years that every child can read by 3rd grade. Let's hold ourselves accountable to this. It means more meaningful and authentic parent and family engagement. As a former school principal, I knew that partnering with parents was critical to our school's growth. Especially now during a pandemic, engaging parents' voices in this process of recovery and addressing disparities is not only important, it's necessary. All parents' voices must be heard. It means honoring native languages and cultures, as well as gifts and talents that our students bring. It means funding and pushing for additional special education teachers and investing in educators and paraprofessionals, in their well-being and in recruiting and retaining them. Because when we invest in our teachers, we invest in our students.
Education Secretary Miguel Cardona, part of a speech outlining the education funding priorities held at the Education Department in Washington, D.C. The publication Education Week adds this: the Education Department could also revisit school discipline guidance adopted by the Obama administration but revoked by the Trump White House. The guidance stated that schools disciplining students of color disproportionately might be in violation of federal civil rights laws. In his speech, the Education Secretary briefly addressed the issue by declaring that given all the disruption the pandemic has caused, students relying on unfair and exclusionary disciplinary policies that push children further away from school is the wrong approach. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg today releasing a report on ways to reduce traffic fatalities. The title is the National Roadway Safety Strategy, or NRSS. Secretary Buttigieg says the goal should be 0 deaths on the roads.
This is a big day. We are here to talk about safety on America's roads, streets, and highways. And in giving remarks like this, it might be customary to begin by telling the story of a person whose life was cut short or forever changed, to help people to picture the reality behind the statistics. But sadly, I think each of us can already think about the reality behind the statistics. I think every one of us can close our eyes right now and picture people we've known, friends, family members, a high school teammate, a coworker, someone whose life needlessly ended far too soon because of a crash on our roads. If you think about what that means, the fact that every one of us can think of people lost and speak of it as a sad but universal truth, it is as if we were living through a war. It is as if it were normal. And certainly you see that in the kinds of numbers that we live with. We have for years been averaging almost 3,000 deaths per month on our roads. So added up in the last decade, we have lost more than 350,000 lives on America's roadways. And things have gotten worse during recent years as people drove at higher speeds, more recklessly, more distracted. We're going to be posting as a department our official fatality data for the third quarter of 2021. And I need to tell you, looking at the preliminary numbers, it's not good. This is a national crisis. When we look deeper at the numbers, we notice two things. One, it is disproportionately impacting some Americans more than others. People of color, Native Americans, low-income communities, people in rural areas more likely to die on our roads. And yet the other thing that we see is this crisis indeed affects everyone, claiming lives from people of every age, every race, every income level in rural communities and big cities alike. We cannot and must not accept that these fatalities are somehow an inevitable part of life in America.
Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg at the Transportation Department in Washington. This strategy report put out today emphasizing 5 areas: changing roadway environments to alleviate possible crashes, emphasizing safer speeds, prioritizing emergency care access after crashes, also promoting safer roadside behavior, and looking into crash safety features for vehicles. On Wall Street today, the Dow falling 7, NASDAQ down 189, S&P down 23. Commerce Department says the U.S. economy grew in the final 3 months of 2021 by an annualized rate of 6.9%. And for all of 2021, growth was 5.7%. That's the highest since 1984. Health and Human Services Department saying that signups for the Affordable Care Act's insurance exchanges, also known as Obamacare, reached a record 14.5 million. Enrollment closed on January 15th. Part of that might be that enhanced subsidies from a law last year are expiring. Now to Russia and Ukraine. Reuters reporting from Moscow saying that Russia said on Thursday it was clear the United States was not willing to address its main security concerns in their standoff over Ukraine, but kept the door open for further dialogue. The United States and NATO submitted a written response on Wednesday to demands Russia has made for redrawing a post-Cold War security arrangement in Europe since it massed troops near Ukraine, prompting Western fears of an invasion. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Moscow needed time to review the response and would not rush to conclusions, but that U.S. and NATO statements describing Russia's main demands as unacceptable did not leave much room for optimism. That was from Reuters. At the State Department in Washington, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland with an update.
Between the U.S. and Russia, between NATO and Russia, and within the OSCE, we have resolved very difficult security and arms control issues before through negotiations. This was true even in the worst of times, and we need to do that again now. So it's on that basis that we hope Moscow will study what we have offered them and come back to the table, back to the bilateral table with the U.S., back to the NATO-Russia Council, and to the OSCE. You've heard us say that we coordinated our responses with our allies and partners, including Ukraine. I want you to know that the 2 documents that we gave to Moscow yesterday were the result of dozens and dozens of hours of consultation with individual countries, including Ukraine, at NATO, and among our OSCE partners. As the President said earlier this week, we are unified in our preference for diplomacy. But we are also unified in our resolve that if Moscow rejects our offer of dialogue, the costs must be swift and severe.
Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland at the State Department. Russia saying that President Vladimir Putin is reviewing the written responses from the U.S. and NATO to Russia's security demands. At the Pentagon, an update on the 8,500 U.S. troops put on heightened alert for possible deployment to Europe if Russia does invade Ukraine. John Kirby is the Pentagon press secretary.
We talked about the Secretary did place a range of units in the United States on a heightened preparedness to deploy. I can say that today that these units include elements of the 82nd Airborne Division based at Fort Bragg, which regularly, I think you all know, maintains high readiness, as well as elements of the 18th Airborne Corps, also based at Fort Bragg, and some elements at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Additionally, from Fort Campbell, elements of the 101st Airborne Division and from Fort Carson, Colorado, elements of the 4th Infantry Division have also been placed on increased readiness. Now, we were not going to, and we don't intend to provide an exhaustive list of every unit that's being placed on prepare to deploy orders, but I can say that other units that will now have an increased readiness posture include elements from Fort Carson, as I said, Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Arizona, Fort Hood, Texas, Joint Base Lewis-McChord, Washington, Fort Polk, Louisiana, Robbins Air Force Base, Georgia, Fort Stewart, Georgia, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, and select additional locations in the United States. These units, all told, include medical support, aviation support, logistics support, and of course, combat formations. I want to just underscore one other note, and that is, as I said many times earlier this week, these forces are on a heightened preparedness to deploy. They have not been activated.
The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby in the Pentagon briefing room. New York Times writing that Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has been silent in public on the Ukraine crisis since December, visited a cemetery in St. Petersburg on Thursday to mark the 78th anniversary of the end of the Nazi siege of Leningrad, in which Mr. Putin's brother died as a child. State television aired brief footage of Mr. Putin in a black overcoat placing flowers onto a wreath in the snow. Wall Street Journal this week has a story about Iran that reads, with talks to restore the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran reaching a critical phase, differences have emerged in the U.S. negotiating team over how tough to be with Tehran and when to walk away, according to people familiar with the negotiations. U.S. officials confirmed over the weekend that Richard Nephew, Deputy Special Envoy for Iran, has left the team. There was a question about this today to Brett McGurk, who is with the White House National Security Council Middle East and North Africa Coordinator.
I know this is a tough question to ask you, but I will. Wall Street Journal and Reuters have reported in recent days the departure of Richard Nephew, who, frankly, was going to forget more about sanctions certainly than I'm ever going to know. Do you have any explanation? Is there a reason for that departure? Some have argued that there is a serious break between those who are arguing for a tougher approach on sanctions and those who are not. Can you shed any light on this?
No, I mean, look, Richard is an incredibly talented teammate, and he's taking a new position at the State Department. So it's a pretty intense environment. You've been on negotiating teams. It's a pretty intense 12 months. But I think Richard's going to a new position at the State Department. I mean, the negotiating team is the intelligence community, Department of Energy, Treasury. It's a pretty large, multifaceted team. I would say, I'm going to just give you an example of how this played out. When the REC team came back to talks in December, they walked in the door with all sorts of walking back everything that had been done over the course of the summer in the former administration of Rouhani. And we had a choice. We just walk away from the table. In fact, what happened was the Iranians met a united front, not only the E3, but also the Russians. The rial collapsed. The Iranian currency collapsed to an all-time low. And the Iranians came back a week later with completely different proposals. So, that in my view is pretty good diplomacy. We're in the ballpark of a possible deal. But again, I'm not going to put odds on this. There's a very good chance these talks collapse very soon, and then we're going to shift to something else. We're ready for that.
Brett McGurk with the White House National Security Council Middle East and North Africa Coordinator, interviewed by Aaron David Miller, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Senior Fellow. On the status of the Iran nuclear talks, Al Jazeera reports that Qatar's foreign minister has held talks with his counterpart in Tehran days before the Qatari emir is due to meet with U.S. President Joe Biden in Washington, D.C. A readout of the meeting by the Iranian Foreign Ministry made no mention of continuing talks in Vienna to restore Iran's 2015 nuclear deal with world powers, but the sequence of events before and after the visit would indicate an apparent effort by Qatar to relay messages between Iranian and U.S. officials. To help the people of Afghanistan get through a winter humanitarian crisis, the Biden administration announcing this month it would provide about $300 million in aid. Estimates are that more than half the population of Afghanistan will face food insecurity. It's That's over 20 million people. But today, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction in the U.S., John Sopko, said there's a large risk that, as in the past, the aid is not going to reach the people who need it most.
Like others before them, the Taliban is learning the bitter lesson that winning is not the same as governing. Since their takeover last August, the Afghan economy has cratered. According to the World Food Program, by the end of November, 98% of all Afghans did not have enough to eat. And this winter alone, over 1 million children are at risk of starvation and death. And access to healthcare services, minimum healthcare services, have significantly worsened. Now, the international community has not ignored Afghanistan's dire straits. Aid, though significantly reduced, has continued to flow. The United States continues to be the single largest donor, providing $782 million in humanitarian aid for Afghanistan and Afghan refugees in the region. And as I mentioned, just yesterday, the UN announced what they call a transitional engagement framework to spend up to $8 billion to support the Afghan people. Yet, while all this aid flows, neither the United States nor any other Western donor at this time has a diplomatic or military presence on the ground in Afghanistan. This lack of on-the-ground oversight increases the risk that that foreign assistance will be diverted before it reaches the people who need it most. Let me be blunt about this. We have seen this movie before. Over the past 20 years, the United States spent over $146 billion on reconstruction in Afghanistan. Of the amount we at SIGAR reviewed, our conservative estimate is that at least 30% of that aid was wasted or stolen. So let's be aware, we spent too much money, too fast, in too small a country with too little oversight. We should keep that in mind as we go forward in humanitarian assistance.
John Sopko, Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, at an event today hosted by the Atlantic Council. He went on to say the U.S. needs to establish a clear purpose for the aid and insist that any organization receiving U.S. funding is fully transparent and also be prepared to change or end a program if the risk of fund diversion is too great. You can find the full program at our video library at cspan.org. And thanks for listening today to Washington Today. You can get top Washington stories sent to your inbox every day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word. Just go to c-span.org/connect to subscribe. Have a good night.